Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode from Nerd Paints. Today I'm pretty excited. We're going to paint the troll from Blood Rage, and I think this guy is pretty awesome. A lot of detail, and it just looks really cool. I really like the models from Blood Rage, so I don't know, I may continue to paint some more from this game. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and start by priming with a black primer, and then after that we're going to go ahead and dry brush him with a couple of different gray tones, and this is going to just help create a base of where I want to have the midtones and the highlights and so forth. So let's go and start by just priming him with a black primer, and then we'll go from there. Okay, now that he's primed, I'm going to go ahead and start by dry brushing by starting with a Mechanicus Standard Gray. So what you're going to want to do is work the Mechanicus Standard Gray into your brush, and then you're going to want to brush off any excess. You don't want very much on there. You want to dry brush it pretty lightly. I'm actually going to use a larger dry brush to cover more surface area with this. And again, just as I mentioned before, just make sure you don't have very much on your brush. But I'm just going to lightly start fanning and covering the model with this darker gray, just to start building up where I want to have the midtones. And then once you're done dry brushing with that, then I'm going to now just switch over and dry brush with a lighter color, Ulthuan Gray. Same thing, get some on your brush, make sure you don't have very much. Get any excess off by fanning on a napkin or something, and just start lightly building up where you want the brightest tones. If the lighter is coming down from above the model, then you want to have the brighter colors on top and on top of his arms, his forearms, and so forth, just wherever the light is going to hit the most. So go ahead and just start dry brushing and go and cover the model with this as well, where you want the lighter colors. So again, I might dry brush on the top of his back. I'm not dry brushing underneath his forearms, underneath his legs, underneath the club, because that's going to be darker. Okay, and once you're done dry brushing, I'm going to go ahead and now move on to working on the skin. I'm using a wet palette. If you need to, refer to one of my previous videos on how to build a wet palette if you don't have one. Or if you want to, you can also purchase one off of Amazon or local store. I'll post below a link to the one that I personally use. But I'm going to use Bugman's Glow to begin with. I'm going to add that to my wet palette. And I'm actually going to use a number 2 brush. So just to start out by building up some of the more detailed areas. But go ahead and add Bugman's Glow to your wet palette, as well as Rakarth Flesh, just kind of off to the side next to it. And with these 2 tones, I'm going to start by blending the 2 together to create kind of a nice fleshy mid-tone for the troll. Just something kind of in between with these 2 shades. And then your wet palette already has a little bit of water, but I'm going to add just a little bit of water to this just to further thin it out. I don't want it too thick. I want it to go on fairly thin. That way some of the darker tones from the primer will remain dark. And you can kind of use the dry brushing that you created as kind of a pattern of where you're going to have the lighter tones and also where you're going to have the darker tones. But go ahead and just start building this up. And again, I'm starting in kind of the detailed area with my smaller brush. And just start working this in. It should go on fairly thin with the water that you added. But once you're done with the detailed areas, I'm going to switch to a larger brush just to cover more surface area. And then maybe even where the brighter tones are, I may even add a second layer. Once you're done with the skin, I'm going to now take some Dryad bark and add that to my wet palette. And again, I'm going to add a little bit of water to that. Basically about a 3-to-1 ratio, about 3 paint to 1 water. You want it fairly thin. And then I'm going to take my smaller brush and I'm going to go ahead and now paint his hair with this. So go ahead and cover all of his hair, his beard, all those areas with the Dryad bark. And now once you're done with the hair, then I'm going to go ahead and now take some Karak stone and I'm going to add that to my wet palette, just kind of next to where the Dryad bark is. And again, I'm going to add a little bit of water to that. I'm going to take my smaller brush and I'm going to use this to paint his teeth as well as all of his nails on his hands as well as his feet. And then I'm also going to use this to paint all of the bones and paint the skull around his necklace, the bones hanging around his front, and then his hair, and then on the back side. Okay, after that, I'm going to go ahead and now switch over to the gold areas. I'm going to add Retributor Armour to my wet palette, as well as Flash Gitz Yellow. Just kind of put those next to each other. Maybe a little more Karak stone if you're running out on your wet palette. I'll re-add a little bit of that to it. And then I'm going to kind of mix the gold and the yellow together to create a nice, brighter gold tone. I'm going to add a little bit of Karak stone just to kind of bring that down just a little bit. I want it to be kind of a creamy beige gold tone, if that makes sense. Kind of a brownish gold. I'm going to use this to paint his gold armbands as well as his bracelets. And then remember to paint the rings hanging out by his nipples as well as his belly. I'm going to use this also to paint all the rings in his hair as well. And also these little trinkets hanging from the back of him as well. Okay, now that we're done with that, we're going to now switch to Mechanicus Standard Gray. So I'm going to add this to my wet palette. And then I'll add a little bit of water to thin that out as well. Then I'll add some of my brush, and then I'm just taking a look here to see how thin it is. You basically want it to start beating up on your wet palette. Then you kind of know that it's thin enough. But I'm going to add a very thin layer to his eyes just to brighten that up just a little bit. Not very much, but just a little bit. I still want it to be pretty dark here within his eyelids. I might add a little bit of this into his mouth as well. But next we're going to take some Mournfang brown, add this to my wet palette. And I'm going to do a mix between the Dryad bark and the Mournfang brown. I want it to be just kind of a darker reddish brown. So it's going to be more Dryad bark than Mournfang brown, but just kind of mix these two together until you get just a nice darker brown with a little bit of that red from the Mournfang brown mixed in there. Then I'll add a little bit of water to this as well. I'm going to take the number 4 brush and we're going to use this to paint the wood on his club. And then just be careful when you're painting underneath. If you get his hands or anywhere else, then just go back to that skin tone and just do any touch-ups that you may need to. And then remember to paint the wood stub that's coming out of the end of his club. As well as at the other end, we're going to paint the wood here, just where the gold trim is going to be. And we'll go back and paint the gold trim as well. I wanted to wait until after I painted the brown. It'll be a little bit easier to paint this larger surface area and then just go back to the gold. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to go back to the gold tone that we created and now go ahead and create this. The design here at the end of his club. Okay, once we're done with that, now we're going to go ahead and switch over to the stone on his club. So again, I'm going to go back to Mechanicus Standard Gray that I added to the wet palette and go ahead and paint the stone. And again, I'm just adding this nice thin layer to the stone block on his club. And when you're ready to move on, we're going to now switch to the loincloth. And so I'm going to start by adding Baneblade brown to my wet palette, as well as some Steel Legion drab. I'm going to put these kind of next to each other, but keep them separate. Add a little bit of water to the Steel Legion drab. Again, just thin this out. And like I said, you want it just to start beating up here, as you can see on the wet palette. I'll add a little bit of water as well here to the Baneblade brown, just to get it prepared. And I'm going to start with the stillage and drab and paint the cloth down here below. You also want to paint the cloth coming underneath him as well. Just like I said before, just be careful not to get his legs. If you do, just go back and do any touch-ups that you may need to. Then where it's the brightest, I may even add a second layer of the stillage and drab. Once you're done with that, I'm now going to switch to this lighter brown, and I'm going to paint where the cloth kind of wraps over here. Okay, and I might switch back to the Mournfang brown that I have on my wet palette and just paint these ropes that are coming around for his necklace. I think that'll do it. This gives us a nice base to work off of. So once you're done with that, then we're going to now switch over to working with some washes and some shades. So first I'm going to go ahead and switch back to the skin tone. Add a little bit of gray in here. I'm going to start bringing out some of the darker tones. Add a little bit of gray in there. But I want the gray to be mixed with the skin tone so it blends really well. So with the Mechanicus Standard Gray and the skin tone that we created, I'm going to mix these two together. If you need to, add a little bit more Mechanicus Standard Gray to your wet palette. But I really just want this to be a darker grayish skin tone. I think this looks good right here. So I'm going to take a smaller brush, using a number 2 again, and I'm just going to start building up, starting with the darker tones, and just start blending this in. So this might be in between in the recesses of his muscles, underneath his forearms, underneath his legs, just where it's going to be a little bit darker, between his knuckles, for example. And I may even add this to the top of his head within the creases. Again, on his back, where the creases are, just start blending this in and just building up those darker tones. The base of his back, just kind of around where his cloth meets his skin, and again underneath his hands. Like I said, anywhere where it's just going to be a little bit more darker, a little bit shaded where the light isn't hitting as well. After that, we're going to now switch over and use some Nuln Oil, and I'm going to use Nuln Oil just straight from the pot, and then I'm going to go ahead and shade his hair. I might even take the Nuln Oil and also shade the stone on his club. Just give it a nice, good wash with the Nuln Oil, as well as the wood on his club and also down here at the base. And then moving on from that, I'm going to take some Agrax Earthshade as well as some Drakenhof Nightshade. I'm going to take just a plastic palette with these little plastic tubs. I'm going to take these two shades and just do kind of a mix. A little bit more of the Agrax Earthshade, maybe a 3-to-1 to the blue shade. I'm going to create a shade between these two. Just going to mix these two together. I'm going to use this to shade the gold on him. Just gives us kind of a bluish brown color. Go over all the gold that's on him, the design at the end of his club, his armbands, his wristbands, even some of the gold rings in his hair. But once you're done with that, we're going to now take some Agrax Earthshade, just straight Agrax Earthshade. I'm going to add a little bit to the base of his teeth. I'm not going to overshade his teeth, but just a little bit more towards the base of his teeth and his mouth. I'm also going to use this to shade his fingernails as well as the nails in his toes. Okay, and then after you're done with the shading, go ahead and just let it dry. It might take 15-20 minutes or so to dry, but go ahead and just let it dry completely before you move on. But if you need to, go ahead and pause the video here, and then once he's dry, then go ahead and continue on. Now that he's completely dry, we're now going ahead and start working on some of the highlights. I'm going to start by adding some Flayed One Flesh to my wet palette. And I'm going to use this along with the skin tone. So put this kind of somewhere near where you have your skin tone. And again, I'm going to go back and I'm going to maybe add a little bit more of the lighter flesh with the Bugman's Glow that we have on our wet palette just to brighten this up. I want to create just kind of a mid and a brighter tone here in the skin tone area. If you need to, add a little bit more Rakarth flesh to your wet palette. But again, I'm going to just create a brighter tone. Maybe a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 of the Rakarth flesh to 1 of the Bugman's Glow. It's going to be this nice brighter tone. And then where it's really bright, that's where we're going to use that Flayed 1 flesh. But as you can see, I'm just kind of continually mixing this together until I get the tones that I want. But the nice thing about working with a wet palette is I have all these different tones to work with. I can jump back and forth between these. So I can jump from the darker tones to these mid-tones to the brighter and even the brightest, which is going to be that Flayed 1 flesh. I may even add a little bit of gray over here just to have a nice darker tone ready in case I need to jump to some of the darker tones. Just continually mixing, creating a few different shades. But once I have the shades that I like, I can now easily just jump between these. So I'm just going to continually jump from these different shades and just continually blend these. If you need to, add just a little bit of water because you want this fairly thin. And then I'm just going to go through and just start building up some of the darker tones all the way up through the lighter shades. And again, remember, you want the lightest colors to be where the light is going to hit the most. So I'm starting with just kind of a nice mid-tone. I'm going to start shading above on his forearms and just start working that in. I'm also going to have a second brush, as you notice, and it's a clean brush with a little bit of water on it. I'm going to use this just to kind of help blend the paint in. So once I add a little bit of paint, then I might quickly grab that second brush and just pull it and just start blending it in. I'm going to do this throughout the whole model. So go ahead and do that with yours, just continually building up these different mid-tones and the brighter tones. So for example, here on the muscle on his arm, I'm going to add a kind of a brighter tone because I know the light is going to hit that pretty well. And like I said, just go through and build up these brighter tones, some of the mid-tones, and just kind of blend them in. Down here on his belly where the light isn't going to be as bright, I might use just kind of more of a mid-tone. Same with on the back of his arm. I'll start adding a brighter shade to the top of his head as well. Pay attention to the recesses, avoid the recesses with the brighter tones. Again, you want to keep the recesses a little bit darker. Like I said, I mean, that's a nice thing about working with a wet palette. You can jump between the different shades. You can build up the darker shades and build that up all the way up to the lighter shades, just working back and forth. I'll use some of this brighter tone, just the brighter shade, just to get the tops of his knuckles a little bit more, just to brighten those up just a little bit. Maybe the same thing on the edge of his nose. And if you need to, take your second brush that's just a little bit damp and just fan that out a little bit. So do the same thing here. Again, just fan that out a little bit. So just go through and do the same thing throughout the model. Anywhere where you think it's going to be the brightest, use the brighter colors, and then if you need to, just fan that out a little bit so it blends a little bit better with that second brush. So go ahead and do that, and then we will continue on from here. But once you're done with that and feel like you're at a good place where you want to continue on, then we're going to go ahead and jump back to the gold. I'm just going to mix this just a little bit more, and I'm going to go ahead and add some highlights to the gold. So I'm going to take my smaller brush. I'm I'm just going to work along the edges, along the gold on his armbands. And then you're also going to want to do the same thing on the bracelets around his wrists. Anywhere that you have gold, you want to just go ahead and add some highlights. You're going to do that just by going along some of the edges. I might brighten that up just a little bit more. So I'm going to add a little bit more of that yellow and mix that in a little bit more. And again, that's with the Flash Gitz yellow. But I'm going to add just a little bit more yellow and then add a few more highlights on top. Again, this is just on the top uppermost areas where the light is going to hit. Okay, I want to brighten that gold up a little bit further, so I'm going to take some Menoth White Highlight from P3. If you don't have this, you can also use White Scar. I'm going to mix a little bit of this in with our gold. Not a whole lot, just gradually mix some of that in just to brighten that up a little bit more. And then I'm going to take my smaller brush, and again with this, I'm going to add just a few more highlights. You don't want to go overboard with this, just a little bit where you know the light is going to hit a little bit brighter. So along the edges of his armband. We'll do the same thing on the top of his wristbands, his bracelets. And then the same thing on the gold design at the end of his club. We'll highlight that as well on top. I'm going to now highlight the nails in his hands, and his teeth, and also his feet. So I'm going to take that Karak stone and the white and just mix that up just a little bit, just to make that a little bit brighter. I'm going to go ahead and highlight the nails on his hands. I'm just using that to paint the tips of the nails and also maybe some of the tips of his teeth. Might even use that to highlight the skull on his necklace. Maybe a few of the bones that are hanging from his necklace as well. I'm going to further highlight his teeth by taking just pure Morrow White or White Scar and have that thinned out a little bit, and then I'm just going to get the tips of his teeth with that. Okay, now I'm going to move on, and I'm going to take the Steel Legion Drab and the Baneblade Brown. I'm going to mix those two together just to brighten up the Steel Legion Drab just a little bit. Maybe add just a little bit of water in there. Might even take some of the Flayed One flesh that we have on our palette and mix that in. Just want to brighten this up just a little bit more. And make sure it's thinned out. I'm going to brighten up the cloth here where the light would hit a little bit more. And then just as we did before, if you need to, you can take your second brush and then just blend that in a little bit. Now with wet blending, I'm not going over all of the paint that I just added, mainly the edges of the paint that I just applied. And I'm just pulling from the edges and then blending that in with the rest of the model. But I mainly just want to get kind of the tips of the cloth down here where the light would hit a little bit better. And then again, I'm going to blend that in a little bit further with my second brush. Now my second brush is clean, it's just a little bit damp, where I can just pull that paint that I just added and just further blend it. Once you're done with that, then I'm going to go ahead and go back to the Baneblade Brown. Maybe just add a little bit of white to that. If you need to, add a little bit more water if it needs to be thinned out more. And I'm going to highlight part of the cloth that's hanging over. And again, go ahead and blend that a little bit further if you need to with your second brush. And just pulling from the edges and just blending that in. Okay, next we're going to go ahead and jump back to the Karak stone, and I'm going to mix a little bit of that in with the Dryad bark, and we're going to highlight the wood of the club. So I'm just applying that to some of the edges of the club, some of the edges on the wood that's going across on this club. And I might even mix in just a little bit of Mournfang brown just to give it a little bit more color to it. Not a lot. The Mournfang brown you just want to use very sparingly. I'm just adding just a little bit. And make sure that's fairly thinned out. Okay, I'm going to mix a little bit of the Karak stone with the Mournfang brown and with the Dryad bark that we created before. I'm going to use this to highlight the stub that's coming out at the end of his club. Okay, for our next step, we're now going ahead and paint the designs that are in the wood of his club. So for that, I'm just going to take Mournfang brown, and then I'm going to go ahead and paint the designs in the wood of the club. Okay, our next step, we're going to take the dry brush. I'm going to use kind of a larger dry brush. I'm going to take Mechanicus Standard Gray and get some at the end of your dry brush. Make sure that you brush off any excess. You can use a napkin, or in my case, I'm using the ridges on this cup. You just want to make sure that you don't have a lot of paint in your brush. But we're going to use that to dry brush along the stone of his club. Just kind of want to brighten up the edges and really, the face of the stone, and just to brighten these up here and bring out the designs. I'm going to further brighten it with some Administratum Gray. Again, add this to my dry brush. I'm going to brush off any excess. You can use your hand if you want, just as a test to see how much paint you have on there. You shouldn't have very much when you brush along your hand. Go ahead and dry brush lightly along the stone with this. Just lightly feathering it on. Then I'm going to take some Longbeard Gray. I'm going to work this into the bristles. And again, brush off any excess. And I'm going to brush this on lightly as well. And by doing this, it adds just different shades, different tones to the stone to make it look a little more natural, brighten up the edges, some of the designs here, and just makes it, I think it makes it look pretty good. So for our next step, I'm going to take some Agrax Earthshade. I'm going to add this to my plastic palette here, something with a little cup, because I want to mix in some Nuln Oil with that. So I'm going to mix in probably a 3-to-1 ratio of Agrax Earthshade with 1 part Nuln Oil. And I'm going to use this to shade the design of the stone. Maybe some of the cracks here around the edges as well, on the face of the stone. I'll add just a little bit on top. I'm just going to brush this in, just in some of the different recesses of the stone. I'm going to brush that into the different recesses. Might even add a little bit into the wood, especially in the recesses right around where those designs are, to help make that pop a little bit more. Next, I'm going to take some Baneblade brown again. I'm going to add a little bit more to my wet palette. I'm going to mix in a little bit of dried bark. Okay, and I'm going to use this to highlight his hair. Now I'm going to highlight his eyes. I'm going to take just a teeny bit of that white on the tip of my brush, not very much. Just going to add just a tiny little dot right in his eye. Just give a little bit of reflective light on his eyeball. Okay, our next step, we're going to work on the tattoos. So for the tattoos, I'm going to take a pen. I'm just going to kind of pre-draw or sketch out somewhat what I want the tattoos to look like. This also just helps mentally as you paint the tattoos on there. Now, I know it's not going to look exactly how I'm drawing this on here, but again, it just kind of helps prepare so I get an idea of what I want to do. Now, the tattoos are optional. You don't have to do this, but I think it just makes it look a little more interesting. But again, the tattoos are optional. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. I think it'll look pretty cool, though. So now for the color that I'm going to use for the tattoos, I'm going to take some Castellan green. I'm going to add that to my wet palette. And then I'm also going to take some Thunderhawk blue and add that. I'm going to go ahead and take those two shades and then just mix those together, about an equal amount of both. I want to end up with just kind of a greenish, grayish color. So I'll take some Mechanicus Standard Gray and mix that in a little bit. So now whenever you do tattoos, you also want to mix in some skin toned color. So I'll take some of the skin tone that we created with the Bugman's Glow. I'm going to mix a little bit of that in there. But I think this looks pretty good. So now what I'm going to want to do is, before I paint on the tattoos, I actually want to draw them out on the model using a lighter color. So if I mess up, I can easily touch it up. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take some Celestra Gray and add that to my wet palette. And then I'll thin that out with just a little bit of water. So again, about a 3-to-1 ratio. 3 paint to 1 water. Your wet palette already has a little bit of water in there, so you don't need to add that much more water. If you do, then just soak it up with a dry brush, just as I did just here. I'm going to take a smaller brush. In my case, I'm using a 0. And I'm going to add a little bit to the tip of my brush. I'm just going to start drawing the tattoos on. And when you draw across the arms or the different muscles, make sure you kind of follow the contours of the muscle. Don't go just straight across if you're going to draw a line. So that way it looks a little more natural. But go ahead, I'm just going to start drawing this on. On the shoulder, I'm going to paint the tattoos on his back, his forearms, on top of his hand. A little bit, maybe a stripe going around his knuckle. Just however I want the tattoo to look, and I'm using kind of the swirly look. If you look at the artwork from the game, then you can kind of use that as a reference on how you want the tattoos to look. Don't worry about getting it exactly like the artwork. Just do something fairly close by adding these different circular motions, the different circular designs. You can add the little dots in there. Again, don't get so hung up on trying to make it look exact like the artwork. And again, I'm just lightly painting this on. So if you mess up, then you can easily jump back to the skin color that you created and then just touch up anything that you mess up with. Another reason why I love using a wet palette, because you can easily jump back and forth between different shades and different paints. As I mentioned before, right here I'm drawing a stripe across his forearm, but I'm following the contours of his muscles. I'm not going just straight across. But I think this is looking pretty good so far. Add just a few designs on the top of his hand. I'm going to add some more designs on his back. And then again, I'll do the same thing on his other arm. I'm going to keep it different than his other arm just slightly, but same type of swirl motions, circular designs, and so forth. Nice thing about these tattoos is they're pretty random. Just adding different swirls, different lines, different designs here and there. I might add a couple designs across his belly. Okay, once we are done and happy with the design, then I'm now going ahead and clean off my brush and then switch to the color that we just created for the tattoos, and then I'm just going to draw over what we've just painted. And if you accidentally get the lines a little too thick, then once we're done, we can always jump back to the skin tone and just trace along the edges of those lines just to thin it out a little bit more if you make your lines a little too thick. But I think this looks pretty cool. I'm happy with how it looks so far. But once you're ready, we'll go ahead and now paint some blood on his stone. I mean, this is Blood Rage, so we've got to add some blood. So for that, we're going to use blood for the blood god. And I'm going to hold the model upside down. I'm going to use some downward strokes from the edge of the stone and just pull it downward. Let the blood collect up in the edges here as it's creating these blood streaks going downward. This gives it a nice natural look as the blood just splattered downward on his club. I'm going to build up a little bit more here along the edges. I'm going to brush some on the face of his club here, on the face of the stone here. And then next I'm going to take a stippling brush, add some blood on that, and then I'll use my thumb to flick the blood onto his stone. This will create some nice natural blood splots along his stone. I might do the same thing along his hand as well. But I'm going to go around and just flick that on the stone here. Gives it a nice natural blood splat. Now his knuckles, I might even just smear that on there a little bit. I don't want to overdo it, but I do want to add a little bit of blood to his knuckles. As if he just got done smashing someone and just splattered blood all over. I think this looks pretty cool, so now I'm going to go ahead and move on to the base. So to do that, I'm going to start with Mournfang Brown, and I'm going to use this to paint the top of his base. Now I also went ahead and, I apologize, but I went ahead and painted the rim with Abaddon black as well. I'm going to end up touching this up a little bit later, but I went ahead and just painted the rim of his base. If you want to do that, go ahead. If not, you can hold off and paint that later, because I'm going to touch that up later as well. And then once you're done painting that, I'm actually going to use two kits. One is, they're both from Gale Force 9. And one of them is Urban Rubble, and that's what this is. I took the Urban Rubble and I just broke a couple pieces and then did some smaller pieces. And I'm going to use that to create some kind of a small stone wall, or an old broken up stone wall in the back here. And I also found just a small rock outside. I went outside and just looked for some different rocks and found a couple nice small rocks. But with the Urban Rubble, I'm going to take some Imperial Primer. I'm going to prime those, just going to paint on a black primer on the little rocks I created from the Urban Rubble kit. And then once I'm done there, I'm going to take some Stirland Mud. And with the Stirland Mud, you want to just kind of add a little bit of a glob here. Careful not to get any on the model, on the troll. And I'm just going to push that around a little bit here. I want to get it underneath the troll if you can. It's a little bit tough, but just going to push that back there. I want to cover pretty much the whole base with that. The reason why we painted with the Mournfang brown before is if you're not able to get everywhere with the Stirland Mud, then you still have that brown color. But if you can, I'm going to go ahead and just cover up the whole base. Just by pushing this around. I'm going to let it build up a little bit here on the back. And you can keep pushing around and build up wherever you want. Just kind of a small hill, or I'm going to add a little bit more on the front here where I'm going to end up putting that stone. And again, just add a little glob and just keep pushing it around. And then I'm going to take that rock that I found, and I'm going to go ahead and push that here into the front. If you need to, take a toothpick and just push it down a little bit further. I want to take some of that Stirland Mud and just work a little bit on top of the rock here. This will help seal it in and help keep it pretty solid once it dries. This will help secure it in there a little bit better. Now with the Stirland Mud, I didn't have it, I made it a little bit thicker in some areas, a little bit thinner in others, just to make it feel a little more of a natural ground. And then on back here, I'm going to take those small stones that I created from the Gale Force 9 Urban Rubble. I'm going to start creating my wall, so I'm going to add a couple stones here on the back. Just press that down into the mud, so that way once the mud dries, then it will seal that in there. But I'm going to take some Lustrian Undergrowth. So the Stirland Mud hasn't dried yet, it's still pretty wet. It just jumped directly into the Lustrian Undergrowth, and I'm going to add this on here a little bit as well. I'm going to build this up on top of the stones here on the back, because I want it to give the impression that this has been here for a while, the wall is broken up, and the grass has just started growing over it. I'm going to take a little bit of super glue just to further seal in this next stone on top. I'm going to add a little bit of undergrowth on top of that one as well. And I'm just going to build this up just a little bit further here, using a toothpick to kind of push it around a little bit more. Like I said, I want to give it the impression that this wall has been here for a while. It's been busted up, and grass and the undergrowth has just naturally grown over it. Might add a little bit of the undergrowth on the front here as well. Again, using a toothpick just to push that around a little bit. And this part is really up to you as far as how you want this to look. For me, I'm just going to keep pressing this. I'm going to keep pushing this around. And I mean, he's in the forest, so I really want to add a lot of this undergrowth in here, mixed in with the brown. Still have some of the Stirland Mud showing through, but for the most part, I'm going to cover up the top with the Lustrian undergrowth. Once you're at a point where you're happy with how it looks, then go ahead and let it dry. You want it to dry for at least 3 to 4 hours. You want this to dry completely before you move on. Now it's up to you if you want to add more to the base, which you can follow along, or if you want, you can stop here. But once it's completely dry, I'm going to actually paint the stones here that we created up for the wall. And for that, I'm going to take some of the Karak stone. If you want to pull the Karak stone from your palette, then awesome. I'm going to take the Karak stone from our wet palette, and I'm going to go ahead and paint the stones on the back of the base here. And then next I'm going to take a little bit of Pallid Witch Flesh. I'm going to highlight the top edges of these stones. Maybe just add a little bit here and there into the stones. I don't want to cover all of it. Mainly just to build up kind of the top highlights of the stones. Kind of gives a nice natural look. So now this next part is optional. I'm going to now work with another kit from Gale Force 9. It's their Hobby Scenics. It's their Jungle Kit. I'm going to pull two things from it. It's their Foundation Dirt, as well as the Spring Undergrowth. And like I said before, if you want to stop where you're at and leave the base as is with the Stirland Mud and the Lustrian Undergrowth, then awesome. I think it looks pretty good. If you want to take it a step further, then I'm going to take the Foundation Dirt and I'm going to add this to it. Just give it some more texture. I'm going to add it in here, mainly in the valley here that we created, just along the middle. But with this, I'm going to take some white glue. I'm going to add that to just my plastic palette because I want to mix in a little bit of water, just to thin out the glue a little bit. I'm going to just take a toothpick and then just stir that up, mix it up. Now you're going to want to use a brush that you really do not care about because this can completely ruin your brush. But I'm going to add some of this glue where I want the dirt to be. So be mindful of the model as well. Try not to get any on the troll or on the club. If you do, then wipe it off quickly so you don't have dirt sticking to the troll. But I'm going to just brush this in here, maybe underneath the stones here on the back. Maybe a little bit in between here also where we created this crevice. But after that, now this can get pretty messy. So if you want, do it over garbage or, get a garbage bag and do it over that, but it's going to get pretty messy. I'm going to take the dirt and just sprinkle it in there. I want to make sure that the glue is completely covered. Lightly tap underneath, just getting the excess and just to shake it around on there. Make sure that it mixes really well and covers that glue really well. Don't be afraid to get too much on there because once it's completely dry, then we can brush off any of the loose dirt that's not on the glue. But once it's covered pretty well, I'm going to let that dry for probably a good 15 to 20 minutes. So I've let mine dry for about 30 minutes actually. I'm going to take a dry brush here and I'm just going to brush off any of the excess dirt that's not stuck to the glue. And as you can see, like I said before, it can get pretty messy. So you want to make sure that you do this on top of a garbage bag or somewhere where you don't care if you're going to make a mess. So next I'm going to take some Woodland Tuff from Army Painter. And I'm going to add some of this. So I'm going to add a little bit of super glue underneath here. I'm not going to go overboard, just add a little bit here and there. So I might add one here on the front, maybe add one on the back here next to the stones. If you need to, take a toothpick and then just further press it down. You want to make sure that it gets on there pretty well. Might even add one here on the side next to his foot. And again, take my toothpick and pressing that down after I've added super glue. And then once you're happy with that, then I'm going to go back to the glue and I'm going to add that Spring Undergrowth from Gale Force 9's Jungle Kit. I'm going to add this on top of the stones, just to give it a little bit more detail here. I think this will look pretty cool. So again, I'm going to brush on some of the white glue that's been thinned out. And again, I don't want to go too overboard, but I do want to give it the impression that some of the undergrowth has started growing on top of the stones. Maybe even a little bit here on the front, at the base of that rock that we put in. I'm going to take that Spring Undergrowth. And again, just as we did before, we want to make sure that we cover it pretty well, the glue, and just kind of press it in. Want to make sure that it's completely covering the glue. And then I'll do the same thing. I'll take my toothpick and just kind of press it in a little bit further. And just as before, you want to let this completely dry. Again, I'd give it a 15, 20, 30 minutes just to make sure that it's completely dry and that it's settled into the glue really well. Once it's completely dry, then take your brush and then just get any excess out of there or shake it pretty hard. And then I might actually add a few more grass tufts in the front here. Again, I'm going to take my brush and just brush off any excess undergrowth. Then you can give it a nice good shake also to get any excess out from underneath. There's actually one part that I completely forgot about. I apologize, but I'm going to take some Dryad bark. I forgot about the straps that wrap around the bones here around his necklace. So I'm going to take the Dryad bark. I'm just going to paint some straps going around that, as well as the bone here on the back, so it doesn't look like it's just floating on there. But after that, I think that does it. At this point, go ahead and do any further touch-ups that you'd like to before spraying with the lacquer to seal him. And I'll include a post below which type of lacquer I use if you'd like. But once you spray it with the lacquer, let it further dry for a good 30 minutes. But after that, I think that should do it. If you haven't already, be sure to also subscribe to my YouTube channel and also visit my Patreon page to support further videos if you'd like. You can also head over there to my Patreon page to find out how you can win some of the models like this one that I painted and featured in my videos. But I hope you enjoyed this episode and found some useful tips along the way. Thanks again for painting with Nerd Paints.